Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming back. That's always a good sign. Before I get into the topic for tonight, which is the theory of evolution, I just want to briefly and really briefly describe kind of what was talked about last time around. My main goal, so hopefully it came across, was that when evidence is put forward by the scientific community, that evidence is interpreted first. So, and that interpretation will change depending upon the worldview that somebody holds to. So I kind of laid out two possibilities, and I suggested that there's more, but there's really two that I'm going to deal with again today, which is there's a naturalistic interpretation of any sort of scientific evidence, and then there is a, for lack of a better word, a Christian or a theistic interpretation of scientific evidence. And hopefully it was understood from what I suggested last time around that they're not equally represented. The two different interpretations are not equally represented in mainstream media, in mainstream scientific literature, and it is what it is. That's the context for tonight. And so as I talk about the theory of evolution, I will first describe the theory. So really briefly, I'll try to describe the theory as Darwin put it forth. And then I will, at some point, I will get into the evidence. And that's where I will spend the bulk of our time tonight, is we'll be looking at evidence for the theory of evolution. And in many cases, I will be describing how that evidence can be interpreted in the two different ways. Okay, one would be the way that you often hear about, like I said, on the news or in mainstream scientific literature. And then, of course, the other interpretation will be one that is very hard to find, usually, unless you go searching for it. And that would be the interpretation that you would find in resources like I have up here, or other resources that I actually put forward at the end of last session. So, let's begin. So, as I said, Charles Darwin is the person, he's the man that put forward the theory of evolution way back. It's been over 150 years now, if I do the math. Has it been? I said the date of his theory is not up there, but I'm pretty sure it's been over 150 years at this point since his theory was put forward. And just to give you a little bit of context, what Charles Darwin was, he's a naturalist, so that's actually what the title that he went by, so that kind of gives you a clue as to his thought process. And he went on a journey. And this diagram that you see up here is, if you follow the red arrows, you can see the journey was pretty far. So he hopped onto this ship called the Beagle, and they left England, and they sailed down around South America. They stopped, any opportunity they had, they stopped at what are called oceanic islands, so small islands that are isolated from the mainland. And so they went down around South America, went to the Galapagos, which is one of the oceanic islands that I'm talking about. And you can see they crossed the Pacific Ocean, came out near New Zealand and Australia, then crossed the Indian Ocean, went down around Africa, crossed the Atlantic, and then crossed the Atlantic again, and then ended up back home in England. And that was a 5-year journey that they went upon. And the whole time, although Darwin wasn't supposed to be the main naturalist on the ship, he eventually became the main naturalist on the ship due to some disagreements and stuff like that. He persevered through the whole journey, and he gathered information. And from that information, he put together a theory. Now, I want to actually I'm going to skip that one. The Galapagos Islands are the ones that are put forward most often as the islands that shaped his thought process, although it certainly wasn't only the Galapagos. Okay, but the Galapagos are the ones that a lot of the information that he put forward as his evidence came from. And one of the cool things about the Galapagos, in fact, most oceanic islands, is that there's species on these islands that are unique. They are not found anywhere else. And so the Galapagos, if you can see the bottom left picture here, that is a sea iguana. So it's an iguana that actually exists and can live underwater, right? And so it spends time underwater, which is kind of unique. And there's a bird up there called a rhea, which is a flightless bird. And so you can maybe, if you know anything about the theory of evolution already, you can maybe imagine that that would have influenced his thought process. And then, of course, you have the giant Galapagos tortoises, which are pretty huge and kind of awesome. So, what I want to talk about in terms of the Galapagos Islands is the diagram that you actually see on the front of your booklet. Now, just to give you some information about this booklet that you have, really the first page, both front and back, are really references about the theory of evolution. They don't really contain anything in terms of the evidence per se. They're just there for you to have. And like I said last time around, if that doesn't work for you, then that's fine. It's just for you if you want to use it as a resource. And the second 2 pages are actually where I will get into some of the evidence, and it's a little bit out of order, but I'm sure you'll be able to figure it out as we go here. So, this diagram is photocopied poorly on the front page there, and you can see that it's a number of birds. In fact, these are finches, or members of the finch family. And what Darwin observed about these finches was that, if you actually look at the aerial view of the Galapagos, I know it's a bit hard to see, but what you can maybe see from the satellite view is that there's a number of small islands, and those small islands are separated from each other. And on those islands, what Darwin observed was a number of different finches, different birds with different features, specifically their beaks. And so if you look at the diagram on your page there or up here on the screen, that maybe is the main thing that stands out to you, that the beaks are quite different in terms of their size. And so it was this, along with all sorts of other evidence, that led Darwin to put forward an idea. And the idea kind of went something like this. So what Darwin suggested was at some point in the past, there would have been a population of finches that arrived on the Galapagos Islands chain, or whatever it's called, I'm not sure. And so this population of, we'll call them ancestor finches, arrived. And when they arrived, they dispersed amongst the islands. And on the different islands, there would have been different food sources. And so let's say, for example, I'm making this up, but let's say, for example, that on one of the islands there were seeds. And the seeds had a particularly strong coating. And so as a result, they required a substantial amount of force to crack open the seed and actually get at the food that would be contained within there. And so this population of birds showed up, and within any population, there's variety, right? There's slight differences within any sort of population. I mean, just look around the room right now. We're not all the same. And it would be the same thing with finches, right? And so within that, there'd be a variety. And let's just say that within that population, there were a few finches that had slightly larger beaks, slightly more powerful jaws, capable of cracking open the seeds and getting at the food. And there was largely no other food source on this particular island, let's say, that the finches could obtain. So, what would happen is, if you have a population of finches, but only a few of them can actually eat, well, those are the ones that get to survive, and those are the ones that get to reproduce. And so the other finches that aren't able to acquire food on that island would die off. And so over time, what the theory goes, that over time, those finches with the slightly larger beaks would then be the ones that reproduce, and their offspring would likely have larger beaks as well, capable of reproducing. And in fact, some of the ones in that first batch of kids would also have slightly larger beaks, again, even more suited for acquiring food on this island, so they can acquire maybe even food from the seeds that are slightly even stronger. And so eventually over time, you can maybe see where this is going, Darwin proposed that over time, what would happen on an island where there was only seeds with strong shells, only the birds with the larger beaks would be able to stay alive and reproduce. And so over time, that's what you would end up with on that particular island. But let's say there's a different island, and on that island there's no seeds necessarily that they can actually acquire, there's no berries, but what there are bugs. And those bugs live, let's say, within the bark of a tree. And so, in order to acquire that food, a bird would have to have a very small beak, a narrow, long beak, in order to reach in between the folds of the bark, I'm making this up too, and acquire those bugs and eat it. And so those would be the birds that could survive on that island, those would be the ones that could then reproduce, and their offspring would likely have smaller, slender beaks as well, more suited to survive, and so on and so forth. And so what Darwin observed on these different islands, so let's move ahead to that, on these different islands was different populations of what looked to be essentially the same bird, but with different beaks. And so from this, he proposed his theory of evolution. And it was proposed in this book, which I actually have a copy up at the front, which was The Origin of Species. Like I said, the title is much larger than that, but that's what it's known as. And I'll actually make reference to this book a couple times in my slides, and when I do that, it's OOS. So if you ever see OOS, it's Origin of Species. And so in his book, he proposed this. He largely talked about the finches, but he also talked about other things as well. And he included this diagram. Now, this diagram is from the back of his book. It's an appendix, but it's also on the back of your first page. And it looks a bit confusing at first. But let me try to explain it really quickly here in light of the finches and what I just talked about. So if you consider, let's see if I can make this work here. There we go. So if you consider this letter A right here, I want you to largely ignore all the rest of the letters. Sure, they're important, but not for the story that I'm telling you right now. So let's say that A represents that population of original finches that showed up on the Galapagos Islands at some point. How did they get there? I don't know. And that's really not the point in terms of what Darwin was trying to tell. And so this is the ancestor finches right here. And let's say this is the island where the seeds were what they could eat. And so they had all sorts of different offspring. That's what these lines represent, the different offspring from those finches. And you can see that not all of the offspring here from a different generation, from a certain generation, was able to have babies. You can see some died off. And so these lines that go nowhere, those are the ones would be the offspring that were unsuccessful. And so here, you can see at this line, that would be another generation of offspring capable of reproducing, and over here as well. And eventually what happens is over time, you end up with, after lots and lots of generations, you end up with different objects across the top here. And that's just from this tree. You can see it starts with A, and it feeds all the way from M, all the way over to A there. So that's just in a nutshell, no pun intended, what the theory is all about. And so the thing with this, though, is this is just a generalized diagram. That's all it is. It doesn't necessarily tell us much specific here. And so what Darwin said was there's room here for what these lines could actually represent. The lines could represent one generation, they could represent 10, they could represent 100, they could represent 1,000, they could represent 1,000,000. Okay, and so what he was saying was those lines could be any number of generations. And obviously the more generations that Darwin said is represented by those lines, the more change that could occur within a population. Okay, so that was Darwin's theory. Now, in order to properly understand this theory, I want to introduce something that shows up in, I don't know, grade 11 biology, or something like that. Is there any grade 11s up there? Any of you take biology? No? Okay. That's embarrassing. So you have, this is the way that species are described, or living things are organized, or classified. And so essentially what it is if you look at all living things, they would fit into one domain here. And there's a domain called eukaryotes. You don't really need to know what that means, so we'll move on. And then they get classified into a kingdom. You've maybe heard of the animal kingdom. So anything that is considered an animal is within that kingdom. And then there's the phylum. Chordates would be something that has a backbone. Am I right? Okay. Something that has a backbone. Then you have the class, which is mammals, which we also fit into. You have the order, which would be that this is a carnivore. By the way, this is a fox that I'm describing here, red fox. The family is Canidae, which actually means it's a canine. So foxes are part of the dog family. If you didn't know that, there you go. The genus is Vulpes, and the species is Vulpes, right? And so that would be the way that the red fox is classified according to what's called taxonomy in biology class, right? So it gets organized. And so this would be the organization of living things. In fact, this part at the top here is extremely general. Really, it describes anything that has a certain type of cell within it, right? And so that's a very general description. But by the time you get down to the bottom, it's very specific, right? It's a very specific description of what is contained within this group here. And you can see the groups get smaller, right, as you move down towards the bottom of this pyramid. So, within this context, I'm going to try to explain what's good about the theory of evolution, and perhaps what's maybe not so good about the theory of evolution. So what is understood, we see this all around us, is that species do change. There is evidence that says that species change. The human species changes, right? We understand that dogs change. We understand that birds change. We understand that cows change. We understand that corn changes. We know this to be true, and there is ample evidence for this change that occurs. And so that is a very astute observation by Darwin, but he certainly wasn't the first one to make it. That was an observation that had been made plenty of times prior to that. Now, in terms of this change, which I will explain a little bit more in a couple minutes here, it is largely called microevolution. Now, that's a word that I understand a lot of people don't like as a distinction there, but I'll explain why they don't like that later on. Or I've also heard it called special or specific evolution that can occur. So let me just give an example here. So these are a few pictures of different kinds of dogs. And you maybe recognize some of the breeds that are up there. And so this represents the variety that occurs within any one particular species. Anybody know what the ancestor of dogs is supposed to be? There's a good amount of evidence that suggests this. Yes, and so according to most research, in fact, it's the North American wolf likely is the ancestor to all dogs that we actually see around us. So all domesticated dogs actually fit into the same lineage as a wolf. And so, actually, dogs still today can breed with wolves. It's still a possibility, so they are technically the same species. And so that actually brings me to a point here, which is that, remember that pyramid that I showed you? How there's the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species? Did I do it? Yes. So the species at the bottom isn't well defined. What is it that makes something a species or makes it a different species? That is actually, there's a whole lot of debate out there on that. And so to suggest that, a pug or a German shepherd are the same species as a wolf might cause some people to kind of raise their eyebrows a little bit. But there's all sorts of different definitions as to what makes something a species. And the ability to reproduce is largely understood to be important within that. Okay, the ability to reproduce together and produce viable offspring. So offspring that can also reproduce. So that's one example. Now I want to just explain how that fits now within Darwin's theory. So essentially, and this is very simplistic here in terms of how I'm presenting it, but essentially what I'm saying is that if you take Darwin's diagram, which is here, I just cropped it from the picture that you have on the back of the first page there, and you place wolves as organism A at the bottom there, well, over generations, we understand that all of this different variation has occurred, right, from the ancestor wolf. Okay, and so that is part of the theory of evolution. We might not call that evolution. In fact, we'd probably just call that variety, right? Variety within living things. But that is understood to be part of what Darwin put forward. Now, this is actually what Darwin looked at. He didn't really talk about dogs too much, but like I said, I read his book, and there's chapters on pigeons. He bred pigeons. So this was beyond what he did in terms of what he observed at the Galapagos, but he actually purchased pigeons and bred them generation after generation. And all of these different kinds of pigeons, which I was shocked to find out what some of them looked like. I had no idea that you had pigeons that looked like this or this. I mean, that's not even its wing. That's part of its foot. Like, that's on its leg. Really weird stuff. But what Darwin understood and what has actually been described is that all of these pigeons come from this, which is actually what I think of when I think of a pigeon, because this is what's called a rock pigeon. And so it's the same idea. There's quite a bit of variety contained within any one particular species. Okay, and so that is part of the theory of evolution. So what's bad? I'm calling it bad, and I'll explain more a little bit later. But for now, what I consider to be bad about the theory of evolution is that Darwin himself, and many people since him, took his theory beyond what the evidence seems to suggest. Because the evidence, when we look around and we see dogs, we look around and we see pigeons, although I wouldn't have thought of that, it seems to suggest that, yes, there is change that happens within any particular species. However, what happens is it's taken beyond that, and it becomes something more than just a theory based on evidence. It becomes a dogma that's based upon worldview. And so and I'll explain what this means in a minute, but this is sometimes called macroevolution, or general evolution, as opposed to the specific evolution. So this is what I'm talking about here. So this is now the family tree, or the tree of life is what this is described as. And so at the very bottom, I just couldn't figure out how to make this so that it was actually readable. At the very bottom, it says original life, right? Or the origin of life is what exists at the bottom. So when the theory of evolution is taken far beyond what the evidence suggests, you end up with something like this. And so at some point, life started. And that original life would have been about as simple as you can possibly imagine. And then that would have gone through a series of changes, which how did the first living thing have the ability to reproduce? That's an interesting question, but people say it happened if they hold to a naturalistic worldview. And so, and then it changes, it evolves, and over time you end up with the more complex organisms all the way up at the top, which is where you find your mammals and where you find Charles Darwin himself. And that is another way of applying this diagram. So notice it is largely the same diagram with a lot more branches on it, but this diagram here is essentially this. It's just at the bottom, instead of it being a dog becoming more dogs, or a pigeon becoming more pigeons, or a finch becoming more finches, it is now one single cell becoming all life that we see on this planet. And that is the theory of macroevolution. And you can maybe already see there's quite a big difference between those two ideas. So, this is what Darwin said in Origin of Species, and this is what led him to take his theory beyond what the evidence actually suggested. You can see he said, "I can see no limit to the amount of change, which may be affected in the long course of time by nature's power of selection." The problem with that is when you actually start looking at nature, we see that natural selection, which is what the process is that would cause this change to occur, natural selection does not seem to operate in the way that he thought it would. In fact, there are distinct limits in terms of how much natural selection can produce. And if you think about the examples that I put forward to you already, they actually are not natural selection, they're artificial selection. They're examples of humans selecting the traits that they want in order to acquire whatever they want in terms of all the different breeds of dogs. Now that doesn't in any way disprove natural selection, but it shows that there's an intelligence required to produce that amount of change in short order, right? So we have to select for that. Natural selection certainly seems to have limits. Okay, so let's look at, let's get beyond this now a little bit. And I just want to wrap up this section by saying this. People throw the word evolution out a lot. I see it all the time on the news. So if you read headlines, you will see probably once a week evolution is proven yet again. And so that you will see that all the time. But people throw the word evolution out there. And what my point is that it's one word with two meanings. There's the meaning that I've described in terms of variation of living things. But then there's the meaning, which is that you start with one single living thing and produce all the living things that we see on Earth. And you could argue that the one definition, so the idea that there's a lot of variety within dogs, or a lot of variety within people, or a lot of variety within pigeons, you could say that's proven. Now, proven in so much as there's quite a bit of evidence for it. However, the other side, that whole tree of life that I showed you, certainly isn't. And so a lot of people will make the claim that evolution is proven fact. I will see that all the time. And that's because what they're doing, instead of separating the two meanings, they're blending them together. And they're saying, look, we know that all dogs came from an ancestor wolf, proven fact. Well, that's a little misleading, because it does not deal with that other side. And there's certainly no proof for that side. So now, I want to actually get into some of the actual evidence for that, though. Let me just describe quickly, back to this picture here. What I'm suggesting is this bottom part of the triangle, there's changes that occur. And remember, species, genus, family, those are human descriptions. Somebody along the way said, hey, I think this is what a species is. I think this is what a genus is. I think this is what a family is. Right? So these are not descriptions that are infallible in any way. And so these are the way that people have decided to describe them. And so what I'm saying is the variation that occurs in the bottom part of the pyramid, there's quite a bit of evidence for that. And that's what I've already kind of suggested today. However, in order to fulfill the theory of evolution to its conclusion from a purely naturalistic standpoint, you have to go all the way back to the top. And you have to say that the change starts here and finds its way all the way down here. And so if that is true, if that were to happen, then we should be able to find evidence for that. The evidence should exist for that to happen. We do have the evidence for the change that occurs down here. And by the way, from a Christian worldview, the word species doesn't really find its way into the Bible. There's a different word that's used. Does anybody know what that word is that describes a group of living things that are similar? A kind, right? Now, do we know exactly what God meant when he said kind, each according to its own kind? No. But I would suggest, based upon the evidence, it's down here somewhere. That's what I would suggest the created kind is. There's a dog kind. There was some sort of ancestor dog, and from that ancestor dog, we see all the variety on earth in terms of the dog family. Okay, so that, to me, there's ample evidence for that. But do we know for certain where a kind fits? No. I've read all sorts of things, and some suggest that a kind fits between order and family. Some suggest it fits between family and genus. And some suggest that it is a species, that there is no change, that even the variation that you see within dogs is not the kind of change that Darwin put forward. Okay, and so there's competing theories out there, even amongst Christians. Okay, but I want to focus now on this top half, because if this top half, macroevolution, if that is true, if that kind of change has occurred, then there should be at least glimpses of evidence within the fossil record. So we're going to look at some fossils in a couple minutes here. In fact, I'm going to look at 4 different categories, but one of these will take up most of our time tonight, which is the transition fossils. So first I'm going to look at embryology, and I'll explain why we'll go there first in a few minutes. Then we'll look at transition fossils. A transition fossil is what Darwin actually made the bold prediction in his book. He said, if the theory of macroevolution is true, there should be a countless number of transition fossils in the fossil record. Those are Darwin's words, right? That we should be easily able to find examples in the fossils of something turning into something else, right? That's the idea of a transition. And then we'll look at the fossil order, because, let me just go back actually. The fossil order is very important to Darwin as well, because according to Darwin, what we should find, if all life started out as one single cell and then became more complicated, when you dig into the ground, what you should find is at the surface of the ground, you should find things that are down here. You should find things that are more complicated. In fact, I should go back to the tree of life. You know, the things at the top of the tree of life, that should be right under the surface, right? It should be the closest thing that we find. But as you work your way down to the very base of that tree of life, that's what you should find the farther down you dig. There should be a very clear order in the fossils if the theory of macroevolution is true. Okay, so I'll talk about fossil order. Talk about fossil order, and then I'll wrap up with a brief discussion of DNA, just because that's extremely relevant right now, and that's where a lot of the work is going on. Now, here's a picture from 1874, which you can see is a couple years after Darwin wrote Origin of Species. This diagram here was drawn by a man named Ernst Haeckel, who was a huge supporter of the theory of macroevolution. So he very much agreed with Darwin in that things started out simple and became more complicated. Now what Haeckel did was he decided to prove this, or to support this, by looking at the embryos, looking at the early stages of development of all living things. And so what he did was, you can see you have a fish, you have a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a rat, and a rabbit, I don't remember which one's which, and then a human. And so what Haeckel suggested was, if you look at this top row, that we're all the same. We're all the same at some point in our embryonic development, which suggests that we all have the information within us from our ancestors, our early primitive ancestors, right? And so that's what the field of embryology is all about. Now, this is a nice, neat diagram, and you would think that is fairly clear-cut, right? But what happened was, in fact, less than a year after he drew these diagrams, people were already pointing out that this isn't what they look like at all. This is actually now understood to be a complete fraud. So let me show you the actual embryos here for the diagrams that Haeckel drew. So you can see at the top, this is Haeckel's pictures of these different species, and at the bottom, these are the embryos using a scanning electron microscope. We now have the technology to be able to actually look at these embryos, and we can see, I can actually capture a picture of them, and we can see that although there's small similarities, they're very different. And so this idea that we're all the same in our embryonic development is highly misleading. Now you might wonder why I would bring something up like that if it was disproven 150 years ago. Well, up at the front here, I have some textbooks, one published in 2011, that has this diagram in there as evidence for the theory of evolution, used in my school. And so any high school biology textbook, there's a challenge for you guys, although you said you're not going to take biology, but any high school biology textbook, what I found, has this diagram in it. It's in there, and no mention of this fraudulent work is made. Okay, and so it's now understood to be not true, and yet it is still in there. In fact, it's in the first few pages of the chapter of evolution. These diagrams show up. I'll leave it there. You can have a look at it. And to be fair, there are some naturalists, so people that are not Christians, that have brought this up as a concern, because they're also concerned about fraudulent information finding its way into textbooks. But if this was disproven 150 years ago, how did it even ever get into the first textbooks by these publishers? That's a good question. So, I want to throw that out there because for those of you, if you ever do end up taking biology, you'll see that. And that might even be taught, because I know for a fact that it is taught in my school by at least one of my colleagues as evidence for evolution. I had a student talk to me about it one time, and I was equipped, which was good, to be able to talk about that. So, let's look at some fossils then. Because, according to Darwin, if macroevolution is true, then what we should find within the fossil record is those countless transition species that Darwin suggests should be there. So things like this, which I'll explain what that is a little bit later on, or like this, which is a transition proposed from apes to humans, or things like this, which is a transition proposed from dinosaurs to birds, or things like this, which is a transition proposed from a water creature to a land creature. And all of these things here are very important in terms of the dogma of macroevolution. In fact, the dinosaurs to birds is catching on as really the new area of proof for macroevolution. And so I want to look at some of those evidences today. So I'm going to start, I guess we'll just go back in time. So I'll start with fish to land creatures. If macroevolution is true, if that tree of life is true, at some point, we didn't spend a lot of time looking at the diagram, but at some point, fish should have left the water and entered the land and become viable on the land. That is the theory. That is what's put forward. And so, if that's the case, we should be able to find examples of that within the fossil record. And so this is what I want to put forward. This was actually found in Canada, in northern Canada, Tiktaalik, which certainly sounds like a northern Canadian name. And so this was found, I think, in 2006, roughly, maybe 2007. And the thing with this particular fossil, is that there was a prediction made. The prediction that was made was that at a certain age in the fossils, they should find evidence of something that left the water and went onto the land. And then lo and behold, they found this, and when they dated it, when they figured out its age, it fit within their prediction. And do you remember 2 weeks ago I suggested that some theories are a little bit dicey because they can't be tested? Well, the way they can kind of be tested is to see what predictions are made based upon those theories, and can those predictions come true? And so this is heralded as an example of a prediction that came true. Now, before I really get into explaining Tiktaalik, I want to actually remind us of this. This is another fossil that the very same claim was made for prior to Tiktaalik. This is the coelacanth, if you've ever read about that. And the coelacanth was a fish that they found only in the fossil record, and what they said was that these fins right here were capable of locomotion on land. And so they suggested that the coelacanth was a transitionary fossil. It was one of the first objects that would have left the water and entered the land, it wasn't necessarily walking, but it had the ability to kind of drag its own body weight around. That was the prediction that was made for coelacanth. And so it's a very similar prediction to Tiktaalik. Very same prediction. They looked at the fossil and they said it can kind of drag its own body weight around. Now, if you know anything about coelacanth, not that long ago, we actually stumbled across them alive, still in existence, in largely the same form as what they have in the fossil record. Now, actually, this picture doesn't look too great here, but this fin here is actually right here, so it is there. And what they discovered when they actually looked at a coelacanth and saw it in action is no, it cannot support its own body weight. The fins are actually not connected to its main trunk skeleton at all, so therefore it couldn't support its own body weight. And those fins actually serve an entirely different purpose. They allow it to be very agile in the water for such a large fish. Okay, you can see a person that's about the size of a person. You can see a person in behind there. And so that was the coelacanth. So if we go back to Tiktaalik now, the same claims are made that this is the transition fish that first dragged itself up onto land. And the same thing is true for its fins as well. Its fins that the naturalists are saying is capable of supporting its own body weight are not connected to its main skeleton, which suggests it could not support its own body weight because the Tiktaalik is actually quite large. It can be up to 8 meters in length. And so for it to be able to support its own body weight without its skeleton, without its limbs being connected to its skeleton, is largely impossible. And so, also just to add insult to injury, they actually found this, which is fossilized footprints of a tetrapod, which was a fully formed tetrapod that is substantially older than the Tiktaalik fossil, which suggests their whole timeline is out of order in the first place. Now, I want to just be clear about ages. I might mention some ages in a couple minutes here. And any ages that I mention are from the naturalistic framework, right? So it's from the interpretation of naturalism. And so I will talk more about ages at the next session, but for now, just the ages that I say are the ages that are put forward by naturalists. Okay, so let's talk about birds to dinosaurs now. So if we talk about birds to dinosaurs, you maybe are wondering why I would even go there. And that is because it is fast becoming a huge area of research for naturalists trying to find proof for the theory of macroevolution. Okay, so there's a lot of research being done. There's actually fossils being found even now, right? So there will be publications coming out probably within the next 6 months or so about this to add more evidence to this theory. Just to kind of get a visual for what's being proclaimed here in terms of this theory, what is being suggested is that somewhere in the past, theropod dinosaurs, which is the same family as Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor, those types of dinosaurs, evolved into birds. So all birds that we see today would have had an ancestor that was a dinosaur. Okay, that was a theropod dinosaur. Okay, so that's the claim that's put forward. Now that's a pretty bold claim, and so let's look at the evidence then to see
well, maybe dinosaurs have more in common with present-day birds than they do with reptiles.
Look at the pubic bone, turned backward, just like a bird. Look at the vertebrae, full of air sacs and hollows, just like a bird.
And even the word raptor means bird of prey.
That doesn't look very scary. More like a 6-foot turkey.
Turkey.
All right, so that's not evidence. But what's that from? Quick. Jurassic Park, right? Which is a pretty good movie. But the claim made in that movie was actually that dinosaurs evolved into birds. Now, I want to start this section by talking about this one. This is the Archaeoraptor, which was put forward as definitive evidence that theropod dinosaurs evolved into birds. So there's an artist's depiction of what it would have looked like. This is part of the fossil right here. And then this is a special, well, it shows several clips actually of the kind of media coverage that was acquired for the Archaeoraptor. National Geographic even ran an entire issue specializing on this, and the claim made that T-Rex had feathers, because T-Rex would have been a theropod. And so this was the Archaeoraptor, which this is where this idea first kind of took off. Unfortunately, the Archaeoraptor is now understood to be a complete falsity. See, what happens with these fossils is that any of these feathered fossils, I have trouble saying that, come from one particular province in China. And these fossils are not usually dug out of the ground by the actual archaeologists, or maybe it's paleontologists, I forget which one's which. And instead, they're acquired, they're purchased. And so they're purchased from the landowners in this province in China. And in order for the claims to be made, this is true for all fossils, by the way, in order for them to be published, remember I talked about the peer review process last time around, in order for them to get their claims or their findings published, there is no standardized safeguard method to find out the authenticity of the fossils. And so what happened was, the people that acquired these fossils, they purchased them from a farmer in China, and then they ran with it, because this fossil appeared to be a perfect transition. It was a perfect transition from dinosaur to bird. Unfortunately, within even the naturalistic community, there was some doubt as to how valid this fossil was. And so they pushed and pushed and pushed, and eventually had the fossil x-rayed, and they discovered that it's actually 5 different species glued together. And this made National Geographic, it made the front page of newspapers, and it is not true at all. The retraction doesn't receive the same kind of media attention as the original claims, though. And we'll see that to be true in some other instances coming up. Now this, though, got the ball rolling, because it got the ball rolling for the idea that there are all sorts of theropod dinosaurs with feathers. Now, well, let me show you a picture here. This is a picture which is kind of a cool fossil, and I'll talk about this one next time around. But this is actually, it's a little hard to see, but this is actually a velociraptor right here, and it is attacking something called a protoceratops, which is kind of like a triceratops, but it doesn't have the 3 horns. You know triceratops? Yeah? Okay. And so notice, though, the artist's representation of this encounter nowadays looks like this. The velociraptor has feathers. So why does the velociraptor have feathers? Because here's a fact for you. The fact is there has been zero fossils of velociraptors found with feathers on them. None. So why is it drawn with feathers? It's because of this dogma that has taken hold that dinosaurs have evolved into birds. And so, remember, the Archaeoraptor got that ball rolling for these theropods to be drawn with dinosaurs. If you were to hop on Google now and actually Google Tyrannosaurus rex, you will actually find a significant portion of the pictures of Tyrannosaurus rexes have feathers on them now. Have they ever found feathers on a Tyrannosaurus rex? No. The answer is no, they haven't. And yet, it's found its way in to be the paradigm. So, I want to show you this one here. This is Mahaka amnogove. I don't even know if I'm saying that right. And so, this is 6 different bones here from this species of theropod dinosaur that they don't have much more than this. In fact, this is it. They have 6 bones for this, and this is how it is drawn. It's drawn like that. So what do you notice right off the bat? Feathers. So were there feathers found in the fossil? The answer is no. But because it's a theropod dinosaur, in fact, it's a theropod from which they only have 6 bones, they draw it as feathered. And this is how paradigms or dogmas take hold in the scientific community. There's an idea put forward, and if it fits the overall idea, which is macroevolution, then it can eventually take hold. Are there naysayers? Absolutely. Both from the theistic community, but also from the naturalistic community, but it doesn't stop it from taking hold. And again, if you were to hop on Google and search even just theropods, which is a whole category of dinosaurs, you would largely find them to be feathered. Here's another one, Boreonychus. This one is an interesting one because back in the 80s they did a dig and they were searching for, I believe it was Tyrannosaurus rex, but it could be wrong. And they found several other bones, and I'll come back to that idea later. They found many, many other bones in there, but they were only looking for one particular species, so all the rest of the bones get put into storage. And there's tons of these bones in storage still today. They haven't even been investigated. But at the same dig site, they went back, like 20 years later, so into the 2000s, and they found more bones. And so they took the new bones, they went to storage, and they actually started piecing some of these bones together, and they decided that they have a sample from a new species of dinosaur, a theropod called Boreonychus. Now, all they actually have is a claw, a few teeth, and a portion of the skull. That's it. And this is what they draw. Again, no evidence of feathers whatsoever, and yet it shows up in the drawings here. In fact, many people actually disagree that this is even a new species. They say, well, we have no idea that these bones even belong together. And so how can they say that it's a new species? So I want to now mention this one, because this one is an example of a fossil that they found with feathers. In fact, and I'm not trained to analyze fossils by any means, but you can kind of almost see them. And I'm not even sure if that's what I'm looking at, but I'm just going to say it is. But with the Archaeopteryx, they actually know that the Archaeopteryx had feathers. You can see what I think are feathers here, down here, and on the tail. And so this is an example of a full fossil, which is very rare, by the way, a full complete fossil, and it seems to have clear evidence of feathers on it. Now the Archaeopteryx, if you know anything about it, is probably a bird. And so it would have feathers. But let me explain that. In fact, I think I have...
Hey guys, welcome back to SourceFed. I'm Trisha Hirschberger. Look at this bird. Now look at a dinosaur. Now back to the bird. Now back to the dinosaur. Now back to the bird. If your brain is saying these two are more similar than Cocoa Krispies and Cocoa Pebbles, then you can thank the 2015 Subaru Legacy for bringing you this story. In 1860, a German quarry worker stumbled upon a fossil of a very, very old bird, the Archaeopteryx, from the Jurassic period, right around the time that Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. These two events, plus the fact that the Archaeopteryx appears to be a wonderful transition between a bird and a dinosaur, gave fire to the theory that birds are the greatest of the great times a million grandbabies of dinosaurs. And today, not only is this theory widely accepted, scientists have actually figured out how the creepy velociraptor that almost ate those adorable kids in Jurassic Park became the feathered flying birds we love to watch today. A new study was published where researchers were able to create a family tree linking certain dinosaur species to the earliest birds. And they claim that this evolution happened pretty fast. Steps along the way include certain species of feathered dinosaurs. The tissue that produces scales is similar to the tissue that produces feathers, and birds today have scales on their feet. Not to mention, scientists already accept the idea that there were dinosaurs capable of flight, one of the main job requirements to be a bird. Other similarities include large eye and nasal openings in the skull, long limbs with hinge-like ankle joints, and clawed three-fingered hands, as well as a reduced tail, S-shaped neck curve, the laying of eggs, etc. Graham Lloyd, co-author of the study and a paleontologist at the University of Oxford, said, "It is particularly cool that it's evidence from the fossil record that shows how an oddball offshoot of the dinosaurs paved the way for the spectacular variety of bird species we see today." Now, even though the study has shown how dinos could have evolved into birds, there are still naysayers out there. Most arguments against the theory say that there is still a lack of sufficient evidence to show lung and finger development or misinterpretation of anatomy. Whatever you choose to believe, today's science points overwhelmingly to the fact that when you see a hawk diving to catch its prey, you're getting a sneak peek 150 million years into the past. I'm Trisha Hirschberger.
Okay, now you might wonder why I would show a video like that. And the reason why is actually because in my line of work, I find that when I talk to young people these days, and they're actually bringing some sort of information forward to me, they're not getting it from the news, they're not getting it from CBC or the National Post or something like that. They're certainly not getting it from scientific journals. In fact, the sources that they often bring forward are videos just like that, because that's where young people are getting their information from. They're hopping on YouTube, they're Googling a topic, and they're getting that information. Am I right? Yeah, I see a couple of them nodding. I think they might be asleep. There's another one that I won't tell you what it means, but there's IFL Science, and that's a huge one that a lot of people go to for information nowadays. Now, the claims that were put forward in that video make it sound like dinosaurs to birds has quite a bit of evidence for it. And they use Archaeopteryx. In fact, they suggest that scientists now know for a fact that there were quite a few dinosaurs that were capable of flight. which got me thinking. I was like, well, which dinosaurs were capable of flight? Unless she's referring to like the pterodactyl or something like that, which is not part of the lineage of birds. Pterodactyl is not a theropod. Then I don't know of any dinosaurs that are capable of flight, and no naturalist would say that, actually. And so there's a few claims made from there. In fact, the interesting part that I found was the part where she talked about what naysayers would bring forward as reasons for why dinosaurs didn't evolve into birds. And I want to expand on a couple of those because she dismissed them, whatever you choose to believe. But it's not really about belief when you're examining the evidence. It's about worldview, but it's also about science, right? And so let's look at some of the claims that were put forward about dinosaurs to birds, and I'll talk about Archaeopteryx in a minute. Because Archaeopteryx, actually I'll talk about it now, how about? Archaeopteryx is a bird. And it's actually understood to be a bird because it has features that are unique to birds and not found in any dinosaurs. Birds, for example, have very low-density bones. In fact, there's air pockets within them. Now, she made the claim that there's dinosaurs that have those, but I don't know of any. I searched through a lot of different fossils, and I can't find any that actually have the air pockets within their bones. Birds also, obviously, have feathers, very different than reptilian scales, and I'll explain that in a couple minutes. Birds have a wishbone, right? The wishbone actually serves an incredibly important purpose for flight. And birds have lungs that are vastly different than reptilian lungs. Reptilian lungs are similar to ours. There they are right there on the right. There are essentially some air sacs there. The air comes in through the tube, the bronchi, and it enters into these alveoli, which are the air sacs. They inflate, and then they deflate, and the air goes back out. So notice what's happening is the air goes in and out, so it's two-directional, is what they say with reptilian lungs. With birds, though, it's really cool. It doesn't work in the same way. Birds have a double intake system, kind of. That sounds like a car. But what they do is they breathe in, and the air goes across into an air sac right here. That's the first inhalation. Then they breathe out. And while they're breathing out, that's when the air flows across through these parabronchi, is what they're called. They're these tubes where the gas exchange happens that allows them to stay alive. Then they breathe in a second time. And when they breathe in the second time, there's air flowing over here, just like we see up here. But there's also air that goes into this tube, into this air sac here. And then they breathe out, and it goes back out. So notice the actual lungs, though. There's the bottom part, the air's only ever flowing this direction, and the top part, the air's only ever flowing this direction. It's called a unidirectional flow. It's one direction. Vastly different anatomy, vastly different structure and function than what reptiles would have. And that is a huge obstacle for macroevolution to explain how this bellows system here could become this over here. Totally different muscles. And the Archaeopteryx, they've actually, by looking at its thoracic cavity, they say the Archaeopteryx had fully developed bird lungs. Now, do they know that for certainty? Probably not. But it doesn't have the right amount of space for bellows. It has the right amount of space for your parabronchi, right? And so, to just shrug off the naysayers as somehow being unscientific very much does a disservice to science. So, the other thing I want to point out is this. These are extreme close-ups of two different features. We have reptilian scales here. We have feathers here. Reptilian scales, if any of you have worked with snakes, you understand that they're actually one piece with raised areas. That's why a snake can shed its skin, and when it sheds its skin, it's all one thing, right? And so you don't have individualized units. With feathers, they actually grow out of pores within the skin, similar to our hair. And in fact, with flight feathers, the ones that would actually be on their wings, they actually grow even into the bone. Okay, and so we should be able to see evidence of that on the bones, which I'll talk about too. Okay, and so these features are just so incredibly different. And to suggest that easily, somehow, magically, this becomes this is pretty far-fetched. And then lastly, just to talk about this is the bones I was talking about here. This is the claim made from a velociraptor that apparently in this red box here, and I apologize for how small the image is, but in this red box here, there's what are called quill knobs. Sounds weird name. But these quill knobs are the parts of the bones where the feathers actually attach to. They insert on the bone here. Now, to see what they look like in an actual bird, here they are on a turkey vulture. You can see them here. So these are the actual quill knobs where the feather will actually join to the bone. But over here, you can see very little evidence of it. And I've looked at several examples that naturalists are putting forward of quill knobs in the fossils, and you just can't really see them. They're just not there. Okay, just quickly before we move away from dinosaurs here, this is kind of an interesting one. This is a Sinocalliopteryx, which is also a theropod dinosaur. And the point of this slide is that if we do a little bit of a close-up, you can see something here, here, and here in its stomach. And here's a diagram here, here, and here. And here's what they're saying about these. That they're saying that these are actually bones from their last meal, from this dinosaur's last meal. In fact, it's its last 2 meals. Likely this was its last meal, and this was its second last meal. And what they've identified from the stomach contents of this dinosaur was that they ate birds. It was 3 birds that this dinosaur, this theropod dinosaur, actually ate. They were Confucianornis, I don't know how to say it. That's the species of bird. They've even identified the species based upon the bones, which really creates a problem if you're going to suggest that theropods evolved into birds, but they ate them, right? And so there's a timeline issue there that needs to be reconciled. How could they feed upon the thing that they supposedly evolved into, right? And so there's a big issue in terms of the timeline there. Now, of course, all of these things that I've brought up, just to be fair, because they've been criticisms that have been put forward. I'm certainly not the first one to put these ideas forward. And so there are rebuttals for them, but the rebuttals are usually to just change the timeline. That's usually what happens. The fossil record just gets changed. Okay, this one will be quick, I promise. So I want to talk quickly land mammals to whales, because this is the theory as to where whales came from. The theory is, if you can recall earlier, at some point fish would have decided to come out of the water and then decide to live on the water, live on the land and reproduce on the land. But at some point, after mammals evolved, they would have gone back into the water and then become what we understand to be modern-day whales, because whales are mammals that live in the water. So that is the evolutionary story that's told. So I want to give you an example of the kind of shenanigans that go on with this particular timeline. To be fair, this timeline is one that's not well understood by naturalists, and that'll become plain in a few minutes here. What you actually see here is the fragments of a skull. This is the drawing of the whole skull, but see these stippled areas, the slightly shaded areas here, here, and here? That is all they actually found. So in terms of a dig site, this is all they found. So it's probably 3 bones plus a few teeth, so maybe 6 bones altogether. And so that's what they actually found. From that, they drew the rest of the skull, and from that, they drew this. Now, the name of this thing is called a pachycetus. Now, cetus is actually the name for whales, right, like cetaceans. And so this is described as the whale ancestor. And notice the way it's drawn. It's drawn as the perfect kind of transition between land animal and whale. Unfortunately, for whoever it was that put together this diagram here, they went back and they found more fragments of the fossil, and they discovered that it actually looks like this, which they're now suggesting probably looked like this. And so this is pachycetus in terms of how we understand it now. This is how pachycetus was drawn and actually still appears in some of those textbooks, just saying. And yet we've understood that it has looked like this for a while now. But it doesn't stop them from drawing it like that. Remember I showed you that picture earlier. So this thing, whatever it is, it looks like a giant rat or something like that, does not look well suited to live underwater, but because of the dogma that it is an ancestor of the whales, it's drawn underwater, because it must have still been part of this timeline. And if you were to hop on Google again, search for whale evolution, you will find pachycetus in its lineage. It's just been moved to the very bottom, which is not where it was originally. Okay, now this is probably one that people are wondering the most about, and probably the most controversial. In fact, Darwin himself knew that. He didn't tackle this topic in his first book. He tackled it in his second book, but he waited some years before he actually did that. Now, apes to people is the paradigm that at some point in human ancestry, we were apes, right? That there was actually some sort of ancestor ape that evolved and changed and branched, just according to, actually I have a picture, I believe. Yeah, according to Darwin's picture, and separated into all the different kind of primates that we might see alive today, including us. Okay, so that is the macroevolution lineage for humans. So, it came from this book, right, The Descent of Man, which was his second book. And really, it's kind of described as taking his theory to the next level. Because in The Origin of Species, you could almost say that, well, maybe he didn't quite go all the way with his theory. But with the Descent of Man, he left no room for doubt as to where he was going with this. So, I want to start with this one. 2002, this was put forward as a transition fossil, an ape man. And you can see the picture here in terms of what they claim it looked like. It's called the Tumai man. I'm not sure why. It might be where it was found. Who knows? But this one, you can see it even made the cover of a scientific journal called Nature. So it was a big story at the time. And this is all they had. One skull. This is the skull from the different angles. That's largely what it was. And it is now well understood that this is not a transition at all. It's a gorilla skull. And yet the retraction doesn't get published, certainly not on the cover. To be fair, it did get published, but it was buried somewhere within the pages of a journal, not on the cover, like the actual original statement. Now, I do have a video.
For 2 years, a team of top scientists have been secretly studying a unique fossil.
This fossil will probably be the one that will be pictured in all textbooks for the next 100 years.
They believe it could be one of our earliest primate ancestors.
Well, it's really a kind of Rosetta Stone because it ties together parts we haven't been able to associate before.
Have they found our oldest complete primate ancestor?
The fossil has more information in it than in any fossil I've ever seen.
Their research has stunned the world.
In the moment when the results of our investigations will be published, this will be just like an asteroid hitting the Earth.
"47 million years ago, the dinosaurs were already long extinct. It's the time when the blueprints for modern mammals were being established. Dense tropical rainforests cover the Earth. They're home to small primates. Among them is an ancestor to us all. For almost 200 years, scientists have searched for links to our prehistoric past. The search has concentrated in East Africa, known as the cradle of mankind. Here in the 1970s, they found the link between apes and man. It offered conclusive proof that we started walking upright 3.2 million years ago. A human ancestor, a female, Lucy. Then in 1984, the remains of a boy were found. Material evidence that 1.5 million years ago, humans had already lost their hair and taken their first steps onto the open savanna. Scientists have long hoped that the Earth might eventually yield an even more ancient fossil that links apes, man, and all the other primates to the earliest mammals on Earth. This could be it. A fossil so ancient it could shine a light deeper into our history than ever before. And so detailed, it could help science reveal the origins of every person on the planet.
Okay, so what you just watched was the introduction to a documentary that was published. In fact, I'll move on. When this fossil was discovered. This fossil has been nicknamed Ida, for lack of a better way of describing it, there was a propaganda machine that was set into motion when this fossil was discovered. Because what happened was, before the scientific paper had hit the journals, So notice one of the scientists there even said, when this gets published, it will rock the scientific community, or whatever the words were that he said it would be like an asteroid hitting the Earth. That's right. And so this was before it had been published. They had put together this entire documentary. Now, if you recognize the voice there, they spared no expense. That was David Attenborough, who is the guy from the Planet Earth, Blue Planet series. And he's fairly well known. And so they made this documentary. They had a special website made for this fossil. They had already written a book about this fossil and how important it was to human evolution. And the day that the publication was to come out, they had a special press conference in New York put on by the mayor of New York at the time, which was Bloomberg. And so this was the kind of propaganda that went into this discovery here. Now, I will talk about some of those other claims that were made about Lucy and some of the other ones claimed in that documentary there. But this documentary aired in both the United Kingdom and the United States on the History Channel before any scientists had actually had the opportunity to critique the validity of this discovery. Okay, and so it was put out there as, this is it, we've discovered it, it's finally known. Unfortunately, within less than a year again, after this finally hit publication, it's now largely been dismissed as not an ancestor to humans at all. It's an extinct lemur, which it certainly looks like, just right off the bat. And so that's what it's now understood to be. And so even amongst naturalists, this is no longer considered to be the link, even though that was the name of the documentary that was put forward. And so I bring that up to point out once again that when these kinds of claims are made, there's much propaganda put forward, much hype made about it, and I'm certain that they find their way into the schools fairly quickly, and yet when the retraction occurs, it's not nearly as much attention. They didn't make a documentary about that, certainly, in terms of saying, whoops, we were wrong. And so that's the story of Ida, which notice even the scientific name, you notice? Darwinius. So they were that convinced that this is it. This is the one that's going to conclusively prove Darwin's theory. Now, the documentary mentioned Lucy. In fact, David Attenborough himself said that Lucy was conclusive proof of the link between apes and humans. Now, this is probably the best example of the whole night of where your worldview can determine how evidence is interpreted. Now, I need to show you, this is the fossil here. So if any sort of history class or biology class Lucy is ever mentioned, it is usually put forward as the missing link, as the transition fossil between apes and humans. Now, the human skeleton has about 206, I believe, bones within it. I could be off by a couple, but it's roughly there. And so any sort of transition would have a similar number of bones within its skeleton. But with this fossil, you can see significant portions are missing. And in fact, it's only about 23% of a complete fossil is what they actually have. So this is the conclusive proof. And so notice, though, the claim is made that this fossil had this species had the capability of walking upright. Now, the only way that you can actually determine if something could walk upright would be there's a few key areas of anatomy that you'd have to look at. First of all, you'd have to look at the feet. Then you'd have to look at the legs. Then you would have to look at the pelvis. Then you would have to look at the spine. And those would be the kinds of areas that you would look at in order to determine if something had the capability to walk upright. Now, the thing about Lucy is both hands and both feet are completely absent. You can see there's several bones missing from both legs. You can see a portion of the pelvis is missing, and certainly a lot of the spine is missing. Now, they've laid it out in this way, but that doesn't necessarily tell us anything. That's just the way they've laid out the bones that they discovered. Now, here's where worldview will help us interpret what this fossil might represent. There's two ways of interpreting it. Either it's a transition with the ability to walk upright, or it's an ape, right? It's an actual ape. And so the thing with this is these represent the two different interpretations right here. And with the lack of completeness to this skeleton, we really can't know which interpretation is correct. To make this a little bit more clear, I have a picture here of the two different interpretations drawn side by side. And you can see this would be, if it's an ape, then what they do is you draw the legs a little bit shorter, and you make the arms a little bit longer. And seeing as all the bones are fragmented and we don't exactly know how they join together, we can do that. Or you draw the legs a little bit longer, and you draw the arms a little bit shorter, which would mean that it walks upright. And again, since we don't exactly know how the bones all go together and they're fragmented, they can do that. And so Lucy is a classic example of how your worldview will determine how you interpret this fossil. Okay, and so this is probably the strongest example that I will talk about. Unfortunately, in the media and in secular scientific literature, it's not put forward as it could be this. It's put forward as it definitely is this, right? And so that's very, very misleading. So I want to just briefly mention, because maybe you've heard of things like this. There's Neanderthal skeletons that have been found. There's a species called Homo erectus, Homo habilis. We are Homo sapiens, by the way. Actually, we're Homo sapiens sapiens. I'm not sure why we get an extra one. And so there's all sorts of skeletons of these particular species found. Now, under a naturalistic framework, each of these are described as a separate species. However, all of these fossils actually fit within the normal variation that we see within humans alive today. Okay, so there's all sorts of different cranial sizes even amongst you guys. Not that I'm going to start measuring. But there's all sorts of different cranial sizes. There's all sorts of different anatomy, facial features. There is a normal variation within humans. In fact, the average cranial capacity is, I think, about 1,200 cubic centimeters, which is what they say. 1,200? Does that sound right? Yeah, I think that's right, in terms of the average brain size. And there are samples of these species that certainly fit within that natural variation. And so under a secular worldview, these are different species. But under a Christian or a theistic worldview, these are humans. They're human fossils, because they all fit within the natural variation. In fact, they've even done studies today that show that all of you sitting here have Neanderthal DNA in you. Does that shock you a little bit? No? No? Okay. Because they're human, right? And so that would make sense for why that would be the case. Now, I put this up on the slide more than a month ago now, as an example of something that was a recent claim. This was from September, just last fall, so just September 2015. And so this was a study, which I need my notes for this one, because I've done a lot of research on this one. This was a find that occurred and was published by all around the world, right? It was published by mainstream media, and the CBC certainly took it and ran with it. And the claim made is that bones of Homo naledi, that's the new name that they've given it, a new human relative found in South African cave, they say that it had a mix of human and ape traits, and it may have buried its dead. So this got me curious, because I thought, since I'd already been thinking about this kind of stuff, I thought, okay, this is probably an example of worldview interpretation rearing its ugly head again. And so I started doing a little bit of digging. I listened to I found an interview by the actual lead archaeologist, the lead scientist on this site with CBC, so it was still with CBC. I found the actual interview and I listened to the whole thing. And I gathered as much information as I could to figure it out. Because when you read a headline, or when you read an article on the news, they do not do justice to the truth of the matter. In fact, they're really putting a headline together to capture your interest, right? So, here's what I found. Let me just see if I can find it here. All right, so here's what was actually discovered in this find. First of all, they believed that there was 15 different individuals of this particular living thing that they found inside this cave. Now, they couldn't actually date how old these fossils are. Now, I will explain why next time around when we get to that kind of stuff, but for now, just they couldn't. And what they found was largely scattered remains of 15 different individuals. And they're incredibly small. You can tell by that picture. You see that? The person's face right beside it. And so what they discovered was this idea that they buried their dead was, first of all, just a casual comment that was made by not the lead archaeologist, but one of the people that was just working on the dig site, and said, hey, they're in this cave, maybe they buried their dead. That was it. Now, in order for them to actually have buried their dead, they would have likely been laid out, not scattered all over the place. Chances are they were chased in there and killed, which would be a different interpretation of the evidence. They probably were trying to take refuge from a predator. Now, let's get to the more interesting part, because they're saying that it had a mixture of human and ape traits. In terms of the human traits, the only thing they found was that there's this tiny bone They found one sample out of all 15 of this tiny bone that looks very, very similar to a bone that humans have in our wrist. And that bone in our wrist allows us to use tools, right? It's one of the things that gives us this kind of amazing range of dexterity. And so they found this bone, only one of them, and they're not certain what it is, but they say it kind of looks like that. And so from that, this claim was made that they had a mixture of human and ape traits. There's nothing else about this find that suggests that there was any human traits associated with this, other than that one sample of bone. And it might not even mean what they are suggesting that it means. And so that is an example of worldview kind of running away with it, right? It's an example of how when we read that, it's confusing. In fact, it's disturbing, because we are led to believe that they certainly are not going to mislead us, right? They're certainly going to tell us, and that if they have found this new human relative, they know a ton about it, and they know exactly that it's part of our lineage. But the reality is they don't. They just know that it's these sample of things that are scattered around this cave. They found one little bone that they suggest may have been in this organism's wrist that caused it likely to have the ability to make tools. Guess what wasn't found in the cave? Any sort of tools, right? So there was that certainly wasn't there. Okay. I don't want to get too carried away with that one. So this is what they actually say it looked like, which is a bit also misleading, because you can see the nose area there, you can see was largely non-existent. They had to fill it in with a plaster cast. They guessed as to what it actually looked like. And yet, in the news, that's the picture that they put forward as to what this species likely was. All right, moving on. Now, I'm done the majority of the presentation, so some of you maybe can breathe a sigh of relief. But I want to briefly talk about the fossil order, because remember I said the claim, and in fact, it might be on my next slide, so let me just check. There it is. So there's the biological tree of life again, right, that was put forward by macroevolution that suggests one single cell becomes all life that exists. And if you think about the way that fossils should be found in the ground, what we should find is the more complicated species should be found near the top, and the simpler species should be found near the bottom. And to be fair, that is generally what occurs, generally. However, if we go back, this is the kind of thing that is actually found. Now, mammals are said to be right up near the top. Mammals are, we're more complicated than anything that came before us, according to the theory of evolution. And this is a quote from somebody that is, he works at the Prehistoric Museum at the College of Eastern Utah, and he himself was on several dig sites. And he said this: "We find mammals in almost all of our dinosaur dig sites. These were not noticed years ago. We have about 20,000 pounds of bentonite clay that has mammal fossils that we are trying to give away to some researcher. It's not that they're not important, it's just that you only live once, and I specialize in something other than mammals. I specialize in reptiles and dinosaurs." So what this suggests, and he's not trying to be misleading here, but what it suggests is that when he digs things out of the ground, he's there not just looking for whatever he finds, he's looking for dinosaurs. And so everything else that he finds largely just gets put off to the side, and he tries to find somebody else that'd be willing to take this. And so within, actually let me just skip ahead, within even the Mesozoic era of rock, and I'll explain that next time, they have found hedgehogs, squirrels, shrews, beavers, and even primates. Now, primates are supposed to be the most complicated organisms that exist. We are also primates. And so this actually contradicts the fossil order, the predicted fossil order. 432 mammal species have been found in dinosaur age rock, and 100 of those are full skeletons. Now, they have modified their theory of macroevolution to include mammals back in that era, but the mammals they include are incredibly simplistic, certainly not primates, and yet they have examples of primates in those rock layers. So that really casts doubt in terms of the fossil order. Now, I want to wrap up today with some DNA. DNA, just really quickly, for those of you that know some biology, DNA is really just made up of four main pieces. There's four main ingredients to DNA. There's adenine, cytosine, thymine, guanine, or we'll just call them A, C, T, and G. Don't worry, this is not going to get overly technical if you're getting nervous right now. And so DNA, in terms of all of your cells, are full of DNA in the nucleus, actually in the nucleolus largely. And it essentially looks like this. It has this spirally structure there, and there's actually a pairing up that occurs between these different molecules. A joins with T, and G joins with C, and that's probably why they didn't take biology right off the bat. So, this is what DNA looks like. Now let's get into what DNA actually is all about. Many people talk about DNA as information. They talk about it as purely information, and that is certainly true. The DNA in my cells carries the information to make me. And so every time I cut myself or something like that, my body has to repair and it has to make new cells, and it makes those new cells me. It puts my information into them, nobody else's, and that's an incredible event that takes place, and we take it for granted. Okay? And every time any sort of cellular process has to occur, DNA is the thing that drives it. DNA drives all of your cells to work together, to be tissues, to work together as organs, to work together as systems, so that whatever you ate for supper, you're now digesting it. That information is contained in your DNA. So, if we think about DNA as just simply information, we can consider it as a number. So here's a number that I've tossed up there. 36291, right? Now, that number has meaning. In fact, you guys can probably name that. If I asked you to name it, you can tell me what that number actually is. Now, the thing with that, though, is I could write it like this. I've reversed it. And it still has meaning. You see that? It just, you might call it something different, but it still is meaningful. In fact, I can totally randomize it, and it still has meaning. Those 5 digits still have meaning. You might call it something different, but it still means something. Or I could even add to it. And it still has meaning. You agree with me? You with me on this? Okay, you guys know how to say those numbers probably, because they're not too big there. However, that to me is too simplistic of a way of thinking of DNA. DNA is information, but it's much more than that. It's also instructions. So, bear with me here as I say this. This is largely the function of DNA, by the way. It makes protein, and the protein are then what works all throughout your bodies. So let's say there's an instruction that might be encoded in DNA. Make the protein called titin. Titin is the largest protein that I believe that we know of. And so, if I reverse that instruction, it looks like that. What did it just lose? It lost its meaning. Or if I scramble it up, maybe, it certainly doesn't make sense anymore. Or if I add to it, I added 2 things, just like I did on the other side. Right? It actually changes the meaning altogether. That is a more accurate representation of DNA. It's not simply information, it's instructions. And because it's instructions, its meaning can very easily be messed up. It requires a very specific order of those A, T, C's, and G's in order for it to be able to tell your body to do what it needs to do. So, in order to fulfill this analogy a bit more, I brought some instructions. I borrowed them from my son. Maybe you've seen Lego instructions before, right? And so this is instructions. It certainly has information, but it requires a certain order for it to actually have the meaning that is required to produce the thing that it's supposed to produce, which is some sort of awesome ninja temple. Okay? And so that is the information and instructions contained within this book. Now, they talk about much work being done in terms of genetic evolution. That you will see written down a lot. The problem is, what they've done is things like fruit flies. They've taken these fruit flies and they've tried to change the genetic information contained within there, the instructions, and lo and behold, they've made some crazy things happen because they've changed the instructions, right? And so that's the kind of work that's been done in terms of DNA. So, let's talk about this one now. This is my last study, so we're almost done here. Some scientists recently have put out a report that took actually several years of research to complete. What they did was they took what they understand to be the simplest form of bacteria that is known. It's called bacteria. I don't know. I don't really get that, but that's what it's called. And so what they've done is they took its genes apart, its DNA apart, piece by piece by piece, gene by gene, and then what they tried to do was narrow it down to figure out what exact genetic information is required as a bare minimum so that bacteria can grow and reproduce. That was the only thing they were looking for. So all the other cellular processes, they said, forget about that. It just needs to grow and reproduce. They narrowed it down, and it was 473 genes were required as a bare minimum for this bacteria to grow and reproduce. Now, to put that into perspective, if we think about that in terms of Lego instructions, what that means is there's not 473 different steps. There's 473 different books. All the pages have to be in a certain order. In fact, there's 351,000 pieces of the A, C, Gs, and Ts just to go into those 473 genes. Now, let's talk about this idea of macroevolution once more. The idea is still, at some point, there must have been a first cell. And that very first cell had to have had the capability of growing and reproducing. And what that study showed was that in order for it to grow and reproduce, it required 473 books, instruction manuals of information in a specific order in order for that to occur. Now, for that to be the case, under a naturalistic explanation, they're going to say that all of those instructions randomly pulled together in precisely the exact order needed for the cell to grow and reproduce. It would be like me taking 473 of these books and cutting out each page, piece by piece by piece, throwing them all into a bag, mixing them up, shaking them out, and dumping them on the floor, and they line up in exactly the order that they're supposed to line up. 473 of these books separated out. That's what it's like. And so it's not as simple as just saying it's information, it's instructions. They have meaning, and they have to be in order. So, this is the problem, the huge flaw with macroevolution. Now, I borrowed this analogy from a colleague of mine who's a way better teacher than I am. And what this analogy is just a simple graph from like grade 9 math class. And so you can see there's 4 points up there. And so those 4 points, if you were to look at them, you would say there's a pattern there. There's a trend. In fact, you could, I forgot to add a slide in here, but in fact, if you were to try to draw this trend, you could draw a line even that connects those dots, couldn't you? And in grade 9 math class, maybe even grade 8, I don't know, you are actually taught that when you have a trend, you can sometimes draw the line a little bit longer than the data actually shows. That's called extrapolation of data. And so maybe you could draw the line like that. And you can see that the line, I extended it quite a bit beyond where those points show. Now, if you've paid attention to the numbers at the bottom here, those are pretty big. In fact, they represent, I just randomly chose, it's not random, the age of the universe. I probably should have maybe made it more like the age of the Earth, but whatever. And so this is 14 billion. And so we've extrapolated it back only to 13,999,970, sorry, that's only in the millions. I don't even have enough digits up there. Okay, so this is how much it's going to prove my point. Now, if I were to extrapolate this all the way back to 0, so this is actually not even enough time, then suddenly, would you say that you can tell obviously what the pattern is? Are you confident that you can say what's going on over here and extrapolate it all the way over here? No. And that is what macroevolution does. Because as I said, if I were to now continue on, as I said, there's microevolution and there's macroevolution. Micro is where all the evidence fits. So micro is what I explained about some ancestor dog becoming all the dogs that we see today, right? A wolf becoming dogs, a pigeon becoming pigeons, a finch becoming finches, right? That's microevolution. That's the 4 data points on my graph. Macroevolution is on the other side. And the evidence just doesn't go there. But we send it there, or at least naturalists send it there, because they have to have some sort of origin explanation. And this is my last analogy. It's kind of like this. I call this side of the diagram microevolution, because when God made everything according to its own kind, he made it with the perfect set of instructions, right? Just like the Lego book there, for it to be able to do what it does. But over time, due to the fall, over time, there's actually instructions lost. And if you think about the way that dogs work, there's a separation that occurs. You think of a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. They don't contain the full set of instructions that the ancestor wolf had. There's a loss that occurred there. There's information gone that can never be regained. And if you think about some of those purebred dogs, many of them have additional problems associated with them. I know golden retrievers have huge hip problems. I know Dalmatians, something like 60% of them are deaf. There's all sorts of genetic problems because as they selected for certain traits, they were accidentally selecting out others. They were leaving out some instruction books that were kind of important. Okay, and so that's a downhill progression. That's microevolution, and there's a substantial amount of evidence for that. We see it around us. Okay? But over here is macroevolution. It's the uphill battle. In fact, what it requires is not just new information, but new instructions. In order for a new trait to be expressed, there has to be a new instruction book suddenly appearing within the DNA so that it can now produce that new trait. That's what's required in macroevolution. For us to go from apes to humans, we had to acquire new instructions somehow for that to happen. And there's really no solid evidence for that. I went through the best examples of the evidence in terms of the transitionary fossils. I went through the best ones. There's others, but they're not even as strong. And hopefully you got from this that evidence can certainly be interpreted to mean something different. Okay? And it all depends upon your worldview. Now, you can really breathe a sigh of relief because I'm done. And so I want to say thank you so much for listening. I think I warned you that this one was going to be a little bit longer than the first one. And if you have any questions or comments, things that you'd like to go through with me, I'm always open to discussion. In fact, I know I make mistakes, and if I've made mistakes and you've caught them, please tell me. If you go out from here and you do your own research and you find something out, please talk to me about it, because I would love to know so that I can build up my own knowledge and be able to do science, I believe, in the way that it's supposed to be done. So thank you very much.